Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, perhaps settle into your favorite blanket, and embark on a quiet journey back to a time that on the surface might seem relentlessly gray and grim, the medieval period. But beneath the mud and the toil, a surprisingly colorful, often bizarre quest for altered states of consciousness was very much alive. Before we fully embark on tonight's journey through the less trodden paths of medieval consciousness, a simple gesture can help us continue these explorations. If you genuinely find peace and insight in what we do here, a quiet subscribe and a little like mean a lot. And we always appreciate a brief note in the comments sharing where you're listening from, perhaps even what comforts you on a long medieval-esque night. Tonight, we're peeling back the centuries to understand what getting high was truly like, not just for the monks and mystics, but for the common folk simply trying to make it through another Tuesday. Imagine, if you will, the gentle caress of an entirely unair-conditioned breeze wafting through a home that lacks anything resembling central heating or even a basic floor. This is your reality. You wake not to the gentle hum of electricity, nor the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, but to the damp chill seeping through straw thatch, perhaps the faint scent of wood smoke and a lingering indeterminate animal odor. Your bed is likely a rough pallet. Certainly no memory foam, and Egyptian cotton sheets would be a concept as fantastical as a self-stirring cauldron. This is the medieval morning, an experience devoid of the countless small comforts and convenient coping mechanisms that define our modern existence. There are no instant pain relievers, no endless streams of digital entertainment, and certainly no easy access to sophisticated mood stabilizers or antidepressants. Life, as they say, was often a polite couple of degrees above freezing, both literally and figuratively. In an age before Netflix binges, and even before a truly captivating novel could offer a proper escape entertainment, options were, shall we say, limited. Your local lord might host a joust if you were lucky enough to witness such a spectacle. Or perhaps you could spend an entire evening watching a knight attempt to read a very long, very complicated manuscript by candlelight. More often, the social highlights revolved around communal gatherings, often fueled by low-alcohol beverages, where the dancing might continue until someone collapsed, possibly from sheer exhaustion, or perhaps an entirely different, more hallucinogenic cause we will delve into later. The daily grind was quite simply grinding. From dawn to dusk, the rhythm of life was dictated by the land, the seasons, and the unyielding demands of survival. Pain, whether from a constant dull ache in your perpetually damp joints, a raging tooth infection, or the inevitable injuries from manual labor, was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of every waking moment, occasionally flaring into a full-blown symphony of agony. Given this rather unvarnished portrait of medieval existence, the logical appeal of anything that might offer even a temporary reprieve, a fleeting escape from the mundane, the painful or the simply inescapable, becomes strikingly clear. Why wouldn't one seek a substance that could make the feudal system seem for a few hours like an amusing abstraction rather than a crushing reality? Why wouldn't a person yearn for anything that could dull the constant throb of a bad back or silence the persistent gnaw of hunger? The human spirit, you see, has a remarkable capacity for seeking solace, for finding loopholes in the fabric of difficult realities. And in the absence of neatly packaged solutions or clinically approved medications, people turned to what was readily available, what grew from the very earth they tilled, or what could be coaxed from the diligent work of insects. They weren't necessarily looking to get high in the modern sense. They were often seeking something far more fundamental relief oblivion, or perhaps a glimpse of something transcendent, something beyond the mud and the misery. It might surprise you given the pervasive image of medieval austerity, but the concept of using substances to alter one's mind, whether for profound spiritual insight to alleviate relentless physical suffering, or simply to make the long, dark nights a bit more bearable, was not some fringe activity. Far from it. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, as common in some respects as baking bread or tending the fields. The distinction between what we might call getting high and getting better was often entirely non-existent. There wasn't a neat little category labeled recreational drugs in the medieval mind, nor were there warning labels or precisely measured doses. Instead, there were visionary states, moments of divine inspiration and pain relief, often all from the same plant depending on how much you ingested and whether you were praying at the time. Sometimes it was just, a sudden unexpected journey into what can only be described as botanical chaos. These substances were integrated into almost every social stratum. You might find a learned monk meticulously cultivating an herbal garden, not just for poultices and tinctures to treat the ailing, but also for plants that could induce a state of heightened prayer or profound contemplation. The local physician, if your village was lucky enough to have one that didn't primarily rely on bloodletting for every ailment, would certainly be experimenting with various botanical concoctions. Even the village witch, often just a wise woman or a skilled herbalist, understood the power of certain roots and leaves to bring about visions, or perhaps just a very deep, much-needed sleep. And then, of course, there was accidental consumption. Imagine for a moment the perennial challenge of food preservation in an era without refrigeration. Grains, especially rye, were particularly susceptible to fungal infections, which, as we'll explore, could turn a perfectly innocent loaf of bread into an impromptu and often terrifying psychedelic journey. The lines were so blurred, in fact, that a substance might legitimately be prescribed to cure a persistent headache, and the next day, in a slightly larger dose, cause the patient to believe they had entered into a solemn, if slightly damp, marital union with the ancient oak tree outside their cottage. It was all part of nature's rather unpredictable pharmacy. The primary source for all these mind-altering compounds, for better or for worse, was nature itself. Your local patch of woodland, the humble herb garden behind the monastery, or even the weeds growing by the wayside, held a surprising array of potent chemicals. Knowledge was passed down through generations, often orally, and sometimes with the vague disregard for precise dosage that characterized much of medieval medicine. A handful of this, a pinch of that, perhaps a whispered incantation, and you were ready for whatever physical or spiritual ailment, or indeed adventure, might come your way. The mortar and pestle were the ubiquitous tools of the medieval alchemist and healer, grinding down roots and leaves, releasing their hidden properties into teas salves or whatever the desired delivery method might be. The channels of delivery, like so much else in medieval society, varied depending on your social standing and immediate need. For the common person, much of the non-recreational use of these substances was out of necessity, medicinal or spiritual. If you had a throbbing toothache, you might find yourself in the hands of the local barber, who, in addition to cutting hair and performing minor surgeries, also dealt in basic pain relief, which often involved some form of herbal sedative. If you were part of a monastic order, a nun might administer a specific herb for either spiritual enlightenment or to alleviate a persistent fever. But then there was the barefoot peasant named Wolf, whose knowledge might come from a slightly more unorthodox source, perhaps passed down from his eccentric aunt, or in moments of extreme desperation, from what he might interpret as wisdom, gleaned from a particularly sagacious-looking squirrel. The point is, there was no single organized system. Knowledge was fragmented, practices were localized, and the intent behind ingesting these substances ranged from the truly desperate to the genuinely spiritual, or simply, as mentioned, the result of a very poor judgment call regarding that moldy bread. Now that we've established the pervasive, if often desperate, demand for altered states, let's delve into the specific substances that medieval people turned to. Our first contender, a true staple of the unofficial medieval pharmacy, is henbane, or Hyoscyamus niger. If you were living in the Middle Ages, you might know it as the stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a particularly vocal duck. Or perhaps the herb that helped old Ilara finally get some sleep, albeit with vivid dreams of talking trees. This plant was incredibly widespread across Europe for centuries. Its dark, viscous seeds and sticky leaves a common sight in gardens and wild patches alike. It was one of those versatile herbs documented meticulously by monks in their herbals, utilized by physicians in their sometimes questionable treatments, applied by those perceived as witches in their rituals, and perhaps most concerningly, ingested accidentally by peasants who simply didn't know better. Henbane's effects were, to put it mildly, a game of nature's Russian roulette. The outcome was entirely dependent on the dosage, which in an era devoid of precise measurements was less a science and more an artistic interpretation of how much seemed about right. A small dose carefully administered might act as a gentle sedative, easing the relentless throb of a toothache, coaxing the restless mind towards slumber, or even reducing the agonizing trauma of childbirth. For a woman enduring hours of labor in a cold, damp cottage, a tiny amount of henbane could be a blessing, offering a much-needed respite from the agony. However, push that dose just a fraction too far, or time its administration poorly, and you were in for a wild ride. We're talking about full-blown delirium, vivid and often terrifying hallucinations, periods of wild agitation, followed by profound stupor, and yes, the distinct possibility of having a heartfelt, if entirely one-sided conversation with a turnip. It wasn't always profound. Sometimes it was just profoundly bizarre. The active compounds in henbane are scopolamine and hyoscyamine, anticholinergic alkaloids that essentially mess with your brain's neurotransmitters, particularly acetylcholine. This interference leads to a bizarre cocktail of sensory and behavioral effects. You might experience profound visual distortions, the world seeming to melt and shimmer, colors appearing unnaturally vibrant or dulled. Disorientation was a given. Knowing where you were, or even who you were, became a philosophical challenge. The extreme dry mouth and thirst, known as cotton mouth, even before cotton was a widespread concept, were common, often leading to frantic attempts to quench an unquenchable parchedness. And then there were the spontaneous interpretive dances, often performed solo, sometimes with an audience of confused chickens. These were not always pleasant experiences, but they certainly provided an escape from the tedium of medieval life, if only through sheer unadulterated chaos. Methods of consumption were varied. Henbane could be smoked, though this was less common than brewing it into a tea. Most notably, it was often combined with animal fat, usually pig fat, and smeared directly onto the skin. This was believed to allow the compounds to be absorbed into the bloodstream, bypassing the digestive system and potentially leading to a more potent, if equally unpredictable, effect. Legally, it wasn't a controlled substance in the modern sense. The concept simply didn't exist. You couldn't be arrested for possessing it. However, its use was certainly suspicious in the eyes of the church. Visions that came from a shrub rather than a saint or a direct divine intervention were often looked upon with profound mistrust, usually branded as the work of the devil or at best dangerous heresy. Yet despite the risks and the theological disapproval henbane had, its enthusiastic users, healers seeking powerful pain relief mystics, attempting to peer beyond the veil of reality, and simply desperate people with nothing left to lose, hoping for any kind of break from their grim existence. It's even a curious historical footnote that henbane, with its sedative and slightly intoxicating properties, found its way into beer recipes in some parts of Europe before it was definitively banned in favor of safer, more predictable additives like hops. Imagine a pint of ale that not only quenched your thirst, but also might lead you to believe you could communicate with squirrels. That's medieval brewing for you. From the common if chaotic embrace of henbane, we now turn our attention to a plant shrouded in even greater mystique and fear, mandrake or mandragora officinarum. This root, often uncannily shaped like a human figure, sparked an entire subgenre of medieval botany folklore and outright panic. Its reputation was fearsome, revered, and profoundly misunderstood all at once. If henbane was nature's Russian roulette, mandrake was more like a botanical Ouija board. You knew something powerful was at play, but you had absolutely no idea what kind of message, or indeed how much sheer weirdness it was going to deliver. Its associations ranged from deep sleep and profound hallucinations to enhanced fertility and mystical visions, or perhaps more frequently simply waking up in a ditch next to a very confused goat, wondering how you got there. The root of the mandrake held a fascinating dual nature, possessing both potent medicinal and undeniably magical properties. It was prized as a powerful sedative, an effective anesthetic for excruciating medical procedures, a true godsend in an era before modern pain relief, and even perhaps somewhat optimistically as an aphrodisiac. Its most celebrated or feared magical property was its purported ability to induce prophetic dreams. Imagine yourself a medieval peasant, plagued by uncertainty, hoping for a sign. A carefully prepared mandrake draught might offer visions distorted and enigmatic though they might be, which you could interpret as divine guidance. The common methods of consumption involved boiling the root in wine, creating a potent if bitter elixir for pain relief, or inhaling its fumes directly, which was considered a quicker, though perhaps riskier path to an altered state. But the mandrake's most infamous legend was the belief that when its root was pulled from the earth, it would emit a lethal shriek, a sound so agonizingly piercing that it could instantly kill anyone within earshot. This terrifying folklore led to some truly creative and ethically questionable harvesting techniques. The most popular method involved tying the mandrake root to a dog's tail, then running far, far away, letting the poor animal do the deadly deed of uprooting the plant. The dog, of course, was expendable as sacrificial victim to obtain the precious screaming root. One can only imagine the conversations around the village well. Old Bartholomew lost another dog to the mandrake last week. Poor Fido. Still, the root should fetch a good price. Such was the value placed on this enigmatic plant, even at the cost of canine lives. Once harvested, the mandrake root would be carefully dried, powdered, and steeped for various preparations. Small figures carved from the root were often carried in pouches as protective charms believed to ward off evil, promote fertility, or simply ensure a bountiful harvest. For some, owning a mandrake charm was akin to having a lucky rabbit's foot, only far more likely to get you accused of witchcraft. And speaking of witchcraft, the church, with its predictable disapproval, viewed anything that caused visions not directly tied to organized religion as inherently suspicious, often labeling it as demonic influence or indeed outright witchcraft. A vision of the Virgin Mary, sanctioned by the local priest, was divine. A vision of a talking badger induced by a mandrake root was almost certainly a pact with the devil. Ultimately, the mandrake existed in a fascinating, precarious balance. Used correctly, it could dull excruciating pain, provide a precious few hours of sleep to the insomniac, or even induce vivid dreams that felt profoundly meaningful. Used incorrectly, which was a frequent occurrence given the lack of precise knowledge, it could lead to violent vomiting, prolonged unconsciousness, or in the eyes of the Church, a one-way ticket to an exorcism. It was a potent symbol of medieval life's blend of practical need, profound superstition, and the constant, often dangerous experimentation with the natural world. Our journey through medieval mind-alterers next brings us to a plant with a name that perfectly encapsulates its dichotomous nature: belladonna or atropa. Belladonna, more famously known as deadly nightshade. The very name belladonna translates from Italian as beautiful lady, a reference to the historical practice of women in Renaissance Italy applying a few drops of its extract to their eyes to dilate their pupils, creating a wide-eyed, alluring look that was considered highly attractive. Imagine the medieval equivalent of modern cosmetic procedures, only with a significantly higher risk of death. A few drops to achieve that captivating gaze, resulting in wide, dark pupils. Yes, but also blurry vision, extreme light sensitivity, and the very real possibility of an unintended and rather permanent beauty sleep. But belladonna's talents extended far beyond mere cosmetic enhancement. Like henbane and mandrake, it was a potent painkiller and a remarkably effective sleep aid capable of inducing a deep, often dreamless slumber. More intriguingly, it was occasionally employed as a sort of medieval truth serum. The disorienting and hallucinogenic effects it produced could loosen tongues, leading individuals to babble nonsensically, or in the hopes of their questioner to reveal secrets they would otherwise guard. Of course, the truths produced under its influence were often a jumble of half-recalled facts and chemically induced fantasies, making their veracity highly suspect. Still, in an age without lie detectors, a dose of belladonna was as good a bet as any. The active compounds responsible for belladonna's powerful effects are atropine and scopolamine, the same anticholinergic alkaloids found in henbane. These compounds profoundly disrupt the nervous system, leading to the dilated pupils, altered perceptions, and sometimes dangerous cardiac effects. As such, belladonna was a common, if highly dangerous, ingredient in many medieval potions, balms, and the infamous flying ointments we'll discuss later. It played a significant, if terrifying, role in questionable medical procedures, particularly in numbing patients for agonizing surgeries like limb amputations. Imagine the desperation of a surgeon knowing a patient might simply die from shock and pain during an operation, reaching for a preparation of belladonna to induce a death-like sleep, hoping the patient would simply drift through the ordeal rather than experience its full horror. It was a calculated risk, often the only available option in an era of rudimentary medical knowledge. Belladonna's place in the medieval medical toolkit was one of extreme caution, or depending on the practitioner, extreme recklessness. It was used sometimes successfully to treat a wide array of ailments from persistent coughs to skin inflammations. During outbreaks of devastating diseases like the plague, where desperation drove experimentation, belladonna might be tried as a last resort, either to ease suffering or in the desperate hope that its potent effects might somehow combat the illness. The physician's skill was often judged not just by their knowledge of herbs, but by their ability to walk the razor's edge between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one. For the ordinary person stumbling upon a patch of deadly nightshade in the woods was a clear warning: admire its beauty from afar, but never ever sample its alluring berries. The dark, glossy fruits might look tempting, but they held the power to bring about a swift, silent end. This plant, more than almost any other, embodied the medieval understanding of nature, beautiful, mysterious, and utterly unforgiving if its secrets were not treated with the utmost respect or indeed profound fear. If henbane and belladonna were the conscious choices for altered states, our next substance represents a far more insidious and often terrifying path to accidental enlightenment: ergot, or claviceps purpurea. This isn't a beautiful flower or a mysterious root. It's a parasitic fungus that preys on rye and other cereal grains, appearing as a slightly enlarged blackened kernel, often mistaken for just a little bit of dirt or a peculiar seed. And in an age where food scarcity was a constant threat and inspection standards were, shall we say, non-existent, this seemingly innocuous fungus could turn an ordinary loaf of bread into the unwitting centerpiece of a full-blown psychological and physical nightmare. The unintentional ingestion of ergot, baked directly into the daily bread from infected rye, was a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures were entirely unsought. The effects of ergot poisoning, known as ergotism, manifested in two horrifying forms. The first was convulsive ergotism, often referred to as St. Anthony's fire, due to the burning sensation it caused, but far more dramatic in its neurological impact. Victims would experience agonizing muscle spasms, violent seizures, and terrifying hallucinations. They might be gripped by uncontrollable fits of laughter that morphed into screams of panic, their bodies contorting in nightmarish ways. Imagine witnessing your neighbor, a quiet farmer, suddenly erupt into uncontrollable jerky movements, muttering to unseen entities, his face twisted in a rictus of both pain and hallucinatory terror. It was a spectacle both horrifying and utterly incomprehensible to medieval minds. The second form, perhaps even more grim in its long-term consequences, was gangrenous ergotism. This form of poisoning caused the constriction of blood vessels, leading to a severe cutoff of blood flow to the extremities. The result was a slow, agonizing process where fingers, toes, and eventually entire limbs would blacken, shrivel, and effectively die. The sensation was often described as an internal fire, a burning torment as the flesh withered and decayed. Limbs would eventually simply fall off, a grim testament to the fungus's devastating power. Imagine the constant dull pain of everyday medieval life amplified to an unbearable burning agony culminating in the loss of a limb without anesthetic, without understanding. It was a truly horrific end for many. Perhaps the most dramatic and perplexing manifestation of ergot poisoning were the notorious dancing plagues. These bizarre outbreaks, recorded across Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries, saw groups of people, sometimes hundreds, gripped by an irresistible urge to dance. They would move uncontrollably for days, sometimes weeks, often, until they collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, or heart failure. Imagine a whole village suddenly possessed by a frantic, unending jig. Their faces contorted, their movements jerky and unnatural. To the medieval observer, these were not medical conditions. They were divine punishments, demonic possessions, or perhaps manifestations of profound moral weakness. The idea that a microscopic fungus on their daily bread could be responsible for such widespread terrifying behavior was simply beyond the scope of their understanding. Medical knowledge of the time was of course woefully inadequate to comprehend the true cause of ergotism. Instead, these mysterious ailments were blamed on vengeful spirits, the wrath of God, or the insidious machinations of the devil. Superstition reigned supreme, and frantic prayers and exorcisms were offered as remedies. It wasn't until much later that the link between the fungus and the symptoms was firmly established. Interestingly, an order of monastic knights, the Order of St. Anthony, gained prominence by running hospitals dedicated to treating the victims of St. Anthony's fire. Their primary and surprisingly effective treatment was simply changing the diet of the afflicted from rye bread to wheat bread, thereby removing the source of the poison. They didn't understand why it worked, only that it often alleviated the symptoms. For medieval bakers, the concept of quality control for psychoactive alkaloids in their flour simply didn't exist. Bread was either fine, a bit chewy, or definitely possessed by evil spirits. There was no lab testing, no microscopic examination. And while it's a topic of modern debate, some historians and scientists have even suggested a potential role for convulsive ergotism in historical events like the Salem witch trials, where accusations of hallucinations, fits, and paranoia might have had a very tangible, if accidental, fungal root. The quiet, almost invisible presence of ergot in their daily bread was a terrifying example of how nature could without warning transform mundane sustenance into a catalyst for widespread madness and unimaginable suffering. From the terrifying reality of ergot, let us now turn to a far more exotic and perhaps even more intriguing accidental intoxicant, mad honey. This isn't your everyday run-of-the-mill honey, the kind you might drizzle on your porridge or use to sweeten a particularly bitter herbal tea. Oh no. This is honey with an attitude honey that, as the name suggests, has the potential to make you very, very mad, or at the very least, profoundly disoriented. It's a rarity produced only in specific mountainous regions around the Black Sea, particularly in what is now Turkey, where industrious bees feast exclusively on the nectar of certain rhododendron flowers. These particular rhododendrons, unlike their more benign cousins, contain a group of neurotoxic compounds known as granotoxins. When the bees collect this nectar, these toxins are transferred into the honey, transforming a sweet treat into a surprisingly potent and often alarming psychoactive substance. Imagine, if you will, being a medieval traveler, perhaps weary from a long journey through the treacherous Anatolian mountains. You stumble upon a remote village, and a kind-hearted local offers you a spoonful of their unique, slightly reddish honey. You take it expecting a sugary pick-me-up, only to find yourself shortly thereafter gripped by a peculiar mix of symptoms. The effects of mad honey are distinct and rather unsettling. They typically begin with a dizzying sensation, a feeling that the ground beneath your feet has become suddenly unreliable. This is often followed by profound hallucinations, where the world around you warps and shimmers, and familiar objects might take on an entirely new, often unsettling character. Vomiting is a common and unpleasant side effect as your body tries to purge the foreign compounds. Your heart rate can slow dramatically, and a sense of profound spiritual visions might descend upon you. Usually, it must be noted in that precise order. It's a journey, in other words, from mild disorientation to full-blown psychedelic chaos, often culminating in an unceremonious embrace of the nearest shrub. What makes mad honey particularly fascinating beyond its peculiar effects is its documented use not just as a recreational substance or folk medicine, but as a weapon. Ancient and medieval sources recount chilling tales of invading armies being deliberately poisoned with large quantities of mad honey. Imagine a retreating army desperate to slow down their pursuers, leaving behind seemingly abandoned villages brimming with inviting ceramic jars of honey. The unsuspecting invaders, perhaps parched and weary, would greedily consume the bounty only to find themselves rapidly incapacitated by dizziness, nausea, and disorientation, becoming easy targets for a counterattack. Both Greek and Roman authors, notably Xenophon and Strabo, documented these occurrences centuries before the medieval period, detailing the incapacitating effects of this unique honey on their soldiers. This was chemical warfare ancient style, relying on the sheer unpredictability of nature. Locally, however, mad honey had its more controlled, more nuanced applications. In small, carefully measured doses, it was sometimes used as a mild buzz spread thinly on bread to alleviate persistent headaches, or mixed into wine to induce more controlled if still slightly unsettling spiritual visions. For some, it was a traditional folk remedy, a way to connect with the divine or simply ease suffering. For others, it was something to be entirely avoided, a known danger lurking in the local flora. It existed in a curious dual role, a potent remedy in the hands of a skilled practitioner, and a potentially dangerous recreational substance for those seeking a more profound or simply bizarre experience. Users would sometimes claim prophetic dreams after ingesting it, seeing glimpses of the future or gaining profound insights into their lives. Others, it must be admitted, simply woke up clutching a potato, utterly bewildered and with a rather upset stomach. The trade in mad honey, though niche, was carried out by ambitious merchants who understood its unique properties and its market value. It would be sold in unassuming ceramic jars, often without any helpful dosage instructions, leaving the consumer to embark on their own often perilous journey of self-experimentation. It represents a fascinating facet of medieval life, a testament to humanity's enduring quest for altered perception, even when the path to it was fraught with the very real risk of vomiting unconsciousness or a deeply uncomfortable conversation with a figment of one's own grayanotoxin-fueled imagination. Having explored the individual profiles of these fascinating and often frightening natural substances, let us now consider the broader context of their administration and how they integrated or conflicted with medieval society. Beyond simply chewing on a root or brewing a tea, medieval people were remarkably inventive in their methods of delivery, transforming raw herbs into sophisticated if unpredictable concoctions. Forget chocolate edibles. In the Middle Ages, your preferred form of altered consciousness might come in the form of a thick, greasy ointment, a murky balm, a potent tincture, or a bewildering potion that promised everything and delivered well something. These methods of administration were almost always tied to specific contexts, ancient rituals, deeply rooted folk medicine, or profound spiritual experiences. This wasn't about a casual weekend buzz. This was about seeking profound relief from suffering, connecting with the divine, or more often than not, just trying to make it through the unrelenting physical and emotional toil of daily life. The effects naturally varied wildly. A carefully crafted potion might simply knock you out for a much-needed deep sleep. Another might induce ecstatic trances, leaving you with vivid, often profound spiritual insights. And a third, perhaps from a less skilled practitioner, might just make you believe with absolute conviction that you had spent the better part of the afternoon attempting to communicate with a lizard, convinced it held the secrets of the universe. One particularly intriguing and notoriously scandalous method of delivery was topical application. It might seem counterintuitive to us, but applying these potent herbal preparations directly to the skin was a recognized, though often whispered about method of absorption. The skin, particularly in areas where mucous membranes are thin and blood vessels are close to the surface, can be surprisingly effective at absorbing certain compounds directly into the bloodstream. This technique bypassed the digestive system, which could destroy some of the active compounds, and was believed to lead to a faster, more potent, and often more direct effect on the nervous system. And this brings us inevitably to the infamous flying ointments. Associated almost exclusively with medieval witches, these ointments were the stuff of legend, fear, and widespread, often terrifying rumor. Their key ingredients were predictably a potent mix of henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, often blended with animal fat, usually pig fat, to create a greasy, easily spreadable paste. The stated goal of these ointments was to induce a euphoric sensation of flying, to allow the user to transcend their physical body and soar through the night skies. The result, for those who used them, could indeed be a transcendent astral journey, a feeling of weightlessness and exhilaration. Or perhaps more commonly, it might simply involve waking up in a haystack hours later with a terrible headache, missing teeth, and absolutely no memory of how you got there, but with a vague sense of having had a truly wild dream. And here's where the story gets awkwardly scandalous, connecting directly to the popular image of witches and their broomsticks. The broomstick you see wasn't just for sweeping. It served as a rather unconventional and certainly memorable applicator for these flying ointments. The greasy psychoactive concoction would be smeared onto the handle of the broomstick, which was then somewhat uncomfortably applied to the user's most intimate areas known for their high absorption rates. This allowed the potent alkaloids to rapidly enter the bloodstream, bypassing the harsh digestive process, leading to a much stronger and faster onset of effects. The visions that followed, flying through the night sky, attending grand feasts with the devil hovering over rooftops like a confused drone, were, from a modern scientific perspective, chemically induced hallucinations. However, to the medieval mind, and especially to the zealous inquisitors, these visions were clear, undeniable evidence of consorting with demons, engaging in illicit sabbats, and performing all manner of blasphemous acts. The irony, of course, is that the proof of their dark pacts was often just the result of a rather potent and unfortunately applied topical anesthetic. Beyond the flying ointments, other consumed potions were widespread. Poppy extract, often steeped in spiced wine, was a common sedative used for everything from numbing the pain of surgery to inducing a state of calm that might be interpreted as divine revelation. Wandering quacks, those itinerant purveyors of dubious remedies, would sell elixirs promising cures for every ailment imaginable, from the plague to a persistent cough. These concoctions often contained potent unlabeled herbs that might indeed offer temporary relief, or perhaps simply make you forget what was wrong in the first place, maybe even cause your shoes to spontaneously dissolve. The outcomes were spectacularly unpredictable: a peaceful, dreamless sleep, a profound communion with angels, a terrifying session of screaming at the moon, or in some particularly unfortunate cases, an unwavering chemically induced declaration of loyalty to a garden turnip. As we drift further into the often unseen corners of medieval consciousness, let's turn our attention from the personal experience of intoxication to its more institutionalized and perhaps less obviously recreational manifestations. Step, if you will, into a medieval church or cathedral. Even if you were not particularly devout, the sheer atmosphere would have been overwhelming. the stained glass windows filtering what little light penetrated the often gloomy interiors cast ethereal patterns on the stone floors. The flickering candles offered a gentle dancing illumination, softening the harsh edges of reality. And then there was the sound solemn chanting, the murmur of prayers, and the low resonant reverberation of voices rising and falling in unison. But permeating it all like an almost visible veil was the rich, distinctive aroma of incense. This wasn't just a pleasant scent. It was God's personal fog machine, and it served a fascinating dual purpose, one of undeniable holiness and another of subtle yet palpable psychoactive potential. The key resins used for incense in medieval churches were frankincense and myrrh. These weren't local herbs. They were exotic, highly valued imports brought over vast distances from the distant lands of Arabia and East Africa. Their very presence in the church symbolized wealth, spiritual importance, and a connection to the sacred narratives of the Bible. Traditionally, incense was burned for a variety of purposes beyond mere fragrance. It was believed to cleanse the air ward off evil spirits, and very practically to mask the omnipresent smells of unwashed wool and fish stew. Imagine a packed church full of people who hadn't bathed in weeks gathered together in close proximity. A generous cloud of frankincense was a blessing in more ways than one. Modern scientific findings have shed a fascinating light on the subtle psychoactive properties of these ancient resins. When frankincense in particular is burned, it releases a compound called incensyl acetate. This compound has been shown to have a mild tranquilizing effect on the brain, specifically affecting the limbic system, which is involved in emotion and motivation. Now translate this finding back to the medieval context. You are in a poorly ventilated chapel, perhaps fasting, perhaps dehydrated, certainly sitting through a sermon that might drone on for hours, if not an entire day. You are inhaling for prolonged periods the smoke imbued with incensyl acetate. While it wouldn't induce outright hallucinations or profound disorientation like henbane, it would certainly contribute to a subtle buzz, a softening of the edges of reality, a general feeling of calm, and perhaps even mild euphoria. The reported visions experienced by monks, nuns, and devout churchgoers were of course credited entirely to divine inspiration, and perhaps they were in a spiritual sense. But the long hours of contemplation, the rhythmic chanting, the fasting, and the constant inhalation of frankincense fumes would undoubtedly create an environment highly conducive to altered states of consciousness. The air was thick with prayers, and quite literally with compounds designed to affect your brain chemistry. Clerical interpretation of these experiences was naturally framed in terms of the soul being lifted to heaven, a communion with the divine. More realistically, from a detached historical perspective, it was also serving to soften the edges of reality for what could be incredibly long, incredibly tedious, and incredibly uncomfortable sermons. It made the prospect of sitting for hours on a cold stone bench listening to pronouncements about sin and damnation just a little bit more bearable, a little more otherworldly. It's worth noting that the use of incense was not exclusive to Christian worship. It was a common fixture in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and pre-Christian pagan rites across the globe. The awareness of its atmospheric and subtly mind-altering properties was ancient and universal. For medieval Europeans, however, the fumes wafting from the thurible were a direct conduit to the divine, blurring the lines between spiritual elevation and a mild, chemically induced state of calm. It was a shared communal experience of altered consciousness, perhaps the most widespread and socially sanctioned high of the era, even if no one would dare call it that. It was simply the smell of holiness, the very breath of God gently settling over a congregation seeking solace, salvation, and perhaps a little bit of peace from the relentless trials of their earthly lives. While the subtle influence of church incense offered a gentle, socially sanctioned alteration of perception, there was another far more pervasive substance that formed the very bedrock of medieval consciousness: alcohol. This wasn't just a recreational drink. It was a fundamental component of daily life, brewed by almost everyone from the lowliest peasant to the most esteemed monastic orders. Beer, ale, mead, wine, and cider flowed freely, not as an occasional indulgence, but as a primary source of hydration, sustenance, and yes, a constant low-level buzz. The ubiquity of alcohol in medieval times stemmed from a very practical, very grim reality. Water was often unsafe to drink. Wells could be contaminated, rivers polluted, and the concept of boiling water to purify it was not widely understood or consistently practiced. Fermentation, however, offered a solution. The brewing process, whether of grain for beer or fruit for wine and cider, killed off many of the harmful bacteria found in water, making the resulting beverage a far safer option for daily consumption. So medieval people didn't drink alcohol because they were perpetually seeking to get drunk. They drank it because it was quite simply the safest beverage available. Imagine your entire family, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, consuming some form of fermented beverage with every meal every day. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. This daily hydration often came in the form of small beer, a low-alcohol brew that was astonishingly pervasive. Unlike modern beers designed for potency, small beer had an alcohol content of perhaps 0.5% to 2%, enough to make it safer than water, but weak enough to be consumed throughout the day without incapacitating the drinker. Even children drank small beer starting from a young age as a staple of their diet. It provided calories, hydration, and a light, almost imperceptible buzz that took the edge off the relentless grind of medieval life. Imagine living in a constant state of mild, gentle relaxation where the world shimmered with just a hint of a pleasant haze. It wasn't about getting roaring drunk. It was about maintaining a baseline level of hydration with a built-in subtle mood enhancer. For wealthier individuals, stronger options were readily available. Potent ales, rich honey mead, and imported wines offered a more pronounced effect. These were the beverages of choice for feasts, celebrations, and moments of more deliberate revelry. Herbal and spiced wines were also popular not just for flavor, but for their perceived medicinal effects, or simply for pure, unadulterated experimentation. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves combined with various herbs were believed to enhance both the taste and the properties of the wine, creating a more complex and perhaps more intoxicating experience. This wasn't just about taste. It was about elevating the very act of drinking into something more profound, more sensuous. Monastic orders, ironically, were at the forefront of brewing and viticulture. For Benedictine monks, for example, brewing beer and making wine was not just an economic necessity. It was often seen as a sacred duty, a pursuit of perfection in the crafting of their beverages. They meticulously refined recipes, experimented with different ingredients, and engaged in enthusiastic taste-testing sessions, ensuring that their brews were not only palatable, but perhaps also provided a certain level of serene contemplation. The monastery, far from being a place of strict abstinence, was often a hub of sophisticated brewing, where the art of fermentation reached its zenith. Beyond hydration, alcohol served crucial social and therapeutic functions. It was the primary painkiller for medieval dentistry, dulling the agony of tooth extraction if only for a few blessed moments. It was used to treat melancholy, that persistent sadness that haunted so many lives in an era of hardship. And perhaps most significantly, it was a remarkably effective tool for simply forgetting for a few hours the relentless harshness of living conditions, the constant threat of famine, and the rigid confines of the feudal system. The tavern, the inn, the local alehouse. These were the medieval equivalents of therapy offices, bustling hubs where people gathered not just for a drink, but for celebration, for mourning, for the exchange of gossip, and for the creation of new, often uninhibited dance styles. The pervasive presence of alcohol ensured that altered states of consciousness were not some exotic rare experience, but a daily integral part of the medieval fabric of life. In a world teeming with unexplainable ailments, constant pain, and a yearning for connection to forces beyond the mundane medieval people often bypassed the formal, often ineffective medical establishment in favor of individuals operating on the shadowy margins of society. The shamans, herbalists, and cunning folk. These were not doctors with fancy degrees or university training. They were the original underground wellness influencers, the unsung heroes and heroines who often possessed a deep generational knowledge of the natural world, passed down not through Latin texts, but through oral tradition from grandparent to grandchild. Think of it, your local physician might recommend bloodletting for everything from a fever to a broken leg. But it was often the cunning folk who knew which bark would actually soothe a cough, or which poultice would draw out the pain from a persistent boil. They treated ailments not just with herbs, but with a blend of ancient wisdom, intuition, and a healthy dose of dignity. These practitioners were the go-to for anything that touched upon altered states of consciousness. They knew precisely which plants to grind, which roots to soak, and, crucially, what the approximate dosages might be to induce anything from angelic visions to an accidental demise. Their repertoire extended far beyond simple pain relief. They offered solutions for profound visions, remedies for curses, guidance for out-of-body experiences, and even perhaps revelations about who stole your last loaf of bread or where you left your best tunic. Spoiler, it was probably under the cow. They understood that the mind and body were inextricably linked and that altering one could profoundly impact the other. It is particularly important to highlight the prominence of women in these roles. Midwives, wise women, and female healers were often at the heart of their communities, dispensing practical advice, treating the sick, and presiding over births and deaths. They possessed an invaluable hands-on understanding of the medicinal and psychoactive properties of plants, knowledge gained through years of observation and inherited wisdom. This made them essential to their communities, yet also feared by the authorities, particularly the Church, who viewed knowledge not gained through Latin scripture or sanctioned institutions with deep suspicion. A woman who could cure a fever with a concoction of herbs, or whose remedies brought about visions, was powerful and therefore potentially dangerous, even if she was simply trying to help her neighbors. This knowledge, passed down quietly, often made these women pillars of support in a precarious world, yet also vulnerable targets during periods of religious zealotry and persecution. The preparations themselves were often a fascinating, if sometimes unsettling, blend of the mundane and the magical. Henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and poppy derivatives would be meticulously mixed with readily available substances, wine for solubility, animal fat for topical application, honey for flavor and preservation, or even in some folk traditions, spit for its perceived vital essence. These concoctions were often accompanied by specific protective phrases, quiet incantations or rituals designed to enhance their efficacy or ward off any negative side effects. The process was as much about the belief and the ritual as it was about the chemical compounds themselves. However, the lack of standardized measurements and the inherent unpredictability of natural compounds meant that bad batches were an inevitable reality. If a patient experienced unexpected side effects, terrifying hallucinations, violent convulsions, or an alarming belief that they could fly like a particularly clumsy goose, it was rarely attributed to an incorrect dosage. Instead, such outcomes often shifted blame directly to accusations of witchcraft. The wise woman who had previously cured your fever might now be accused of causing you to see flying goats marry trees or engage in unholy rituals. The community, despite its reliance on these figures for genuine relief, could be quick to turn on them when things went awry, swayed by fear and suspicion. Yet despite the inherent risks and the ever-present disapproval of the church and other authorities, people continued to turn to shamans, herbalists, and cunning folk for their fevers, their aching joints for help in childbirth, or even for more unusual requests like contacting dead relatives to ask about forgotten inheritances or where they had hidden their small savings. In a world with so little comfort and so much suffering, their services, particularly those involving a bit of gentle or not so gentle mind alteration, were simply too valuable to disregard. Our journey through medieval altered states has thus far primarily focused on Europe, a continent often shrouded in a veil of religious dogma and technological stagnation during this period. But to truly understand the broader human experience with mind-altering substances, we must cast our gaze eastward and southward to the flourishing cities and vibrant intellectual centers of the Islamic Golden Age. Here, centuries ahead of Europe in many respects, a contrasting paradigm emerged, particularly around the use of hashish. Imagine cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo bustling with scholars, poets, merchants, and mystics, vibrant hubs of learning and culture, while much of Europe was still navigating the complexities of the feudal system. In these dynamic environments, cannabis resin in the form of hashish was widely known and consumed. Unlike the often bitter or unpalatable herbal concoctions of Europe, hashish was frequently mixed with honey and spices, creating what might well have been the first genuinely palatable edible in history. Imagine a sweet, fragrant confection, a treat that not only delighted the taste buds, but also promised a journey into altered perception. It was a far cry from a mouthful of greasy, psychoactive pig fat. The use of hashish in the Islamic world was not a hidden practice. On the contrary, it was extensively documented by scholars, mystics, and physicians, often with remarkable detail and surprising objectivity. These weren't just vague references. They were detailed accounts that suggested extensive field testing, careful observation of effects, and nuanced discussions of its properties. Islamic scholars, with their deep respect for scientific inquiry, approached it with a level of intellectual curiosity that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. Mystics, particularly within the Sufi tradition, saw it as a tool for spiritual exploration. Physicians, always seeking new ways to alleviate suffering, experimented with its medicinal applications. Hashish occupied a fascinating space between recreational use and spiritual practice. Recreational consumption was certainly common. People enjoyed its relaxing and euphoric effects, using it to unwind, to foster camaraderie, or simply to lighten the burdens of daily life. But for many, especially within Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, hashish, was a profound aid to spiritual union. It was believed to facilitate ego dissolution, allowing practitioners to transcend the self and connect more directly with the divine. It induced states of deep contemplation, promoting introspection and abstract thought, often leading to profound, thoughtful stares at walls that might last for hours. Sufi poets and philosophers, known for their intense emotion and abstract metaphors, often spoke of hashish in terms of profound insight, its effects woven into their spiritual quest for truth and enlightenment. Naturally, despite its widespread acceptance and use, there were attempts at prohibition. Rulers concerned about social order and the moral fabric of their societies occasionally tried to ban hashish, fearing that its use would lead to laziness, moral decay, or perhaps, most concerningly for the authorities, excessive giggling during prayer. However, these attempts at prohibition generally met with low success rates. The substance was simply too ingrained in the culture, too accessible, and too widely appreciated for its various effects to be effectively suppressed. It's also important to address the infamous Hashashin myth, which emerged later largely from Western misinterpretations. This legendary sect of assassins was supposedly induced into a drug-fueled frenzy by hashish before embarking on their missions, a myth that largely served to demonize a group perceived as dangerous. While the word assassin likely derives from hashishin, the idea that they were drug-crazed killers is largely a fabrication highlighting the mystique and suspicion that could surround the substance even in cultures that embraced it. The contrast with Europe is stark. While medieval Europeans were grappling with the terrifying, often accidental hallucinations induced by ergot or the dangerous unpredictability of belladonna, the Islamic world was already engaged in a sophisticated, sometimes scholarly exploration of cannabis. They understood its properties, cultivated it deliberately, and incorporated it into their social and spiritual lives. Europe, meanwhile, was centuries away from even beginning to understand the plant, without either burning it as a form of devil grass or simply dismissing it as a dangerous pagan herb. The Islamic Golden Age stands as a testament to an entirely different, more enlightened approach to altered states of consciousness, born of a thirst for knowledge and a cultural openness that was tragically often absent in the West. Having journeyed through the individual substances and their cultural contexts, it's time to pull back and examine how medieval people in their bewildering variety actually perceived getting high. This was not a monolithic view. It was a deeply conflicted, often contradictory understanding, a vast, weird gray area between miracle and misdemeanor, between health and heresy. The modern concept of recreational drug use would have been utterly alien to them. Their understanding was far more practical, far more steeped in the immediate realities of pain, spiritual yearning, and sheer desperation. For healers, herbalists, and indeed anyone trying to alleviate suffering, the outcome was the primary measure of success. If a specific herb or potion dulled pain, slowed the relentless march of a fever, or made the agonizing process of childbirth even marginally less horrifying, it was a triumph. The fact that the patient might spend a few hours reciting psalms backward in what they believed was perfect Aramaic, or insisted that the family cat had just delivered a heartfelt monologue in perfect French, was often deemed a perfectly acceptable, if somewhat amusing, side effect. The goal was relief, and if a bit of bizarre disorientation came with it, well, that was just part of nature's unpredictable generosity. Spiritual revelations were another matter entirely. For monks dedicated to quiet contemplation, for mystics seeking direct communion with the divine, or for anyone genuinely searching for spiritual answers, Hallucinations were often interpreted as profound revelations, signs of sanctity, or direct messages from God or the saints. Imagine a hermit isolated in his cell, fasting and praying, then partaking of a carefully prepared herbal infusion. If the void whispered back to him in perfect Latin, revealing ancient truths, he was not just getting high. He was in his own mind, and perhaps in the eyes of his devout community, on the fast track to sainthood. The distinction between a chemically induced vision and a divine visitation was entirely dependent on context, intent, and crucially, the interpretation of the beholder and their community. Intent mattered enormously. An accidental high, perhaps from consuming rye bread contaminated with ergot, was often viewed with pity or a search for a spiritual cause like demonic possession, but rarely with moral condemnation of the individual who was merely an unfortunate victim. Seeing Jesus or a saint during an altered state was generally acceptable, often revered, even if the vision was induced by a potent brew. But flirting with a goat demon believing you could fly to a witch's Sabbath, or engaging in conversations with inanimate objects, unless that object was a holy relic, was a definite problem. It wasn't about the substance itself as much as the outcome and the interpretation of that outcome. The Church, as the dominant moral and intellectual authority of the age, held a particularly conflicted and often suspicious stance. While the use of incense in churches was permissible, and indeed encouraged perhaps partly for its subtle tranquilizing effect, anything that induced altered states outside its direct control was viewed with deep mistrust. Loss of control intoxication, especially if it led to unholy thoughts or inconvenient honesty, and visions not sanctioned by official doctrine were branded as dangerous, heretical, or outright demonic. The logic was simple if deeply flawed. Saints had visions of divine glory and spoke with angels. Peasants who saw talking animals or imagined themselves flying were almost certainly possessed. This double standard highlighted the Church's desire to control spiritual experience and maintain its monopoly on divine interpretation. Yet despite the official pronouncements and the ever-present threat of heresy accusations, the common folk often held a remarkably relaxed view of these substances within their daily lives. Your neighbor's sleeping potion might also double as a psychedelic nightcap, and that was just part of life. Poppy wine was for pain, perhaps, but also for a bit of calm. Henbane tea might ease a fever, but it also made a particularly annoying visit from the in-laws slightly more tolerable. These substances were seen as a natural part of the medicine chest, a means to cope with the relentless hardships of existence. They blurred the lines between medicine mysticism and simple escape. In a world teeming with the very real threats of demons, saints, devastating plagues, and constant turnip famines, finding a little herbal escape. A temporary reprieve from reality was often not the worst idea. It was, in essence, a bizarre, often dangerous, but ultimately very human response to an overwhelmingly difficult existence. Now let's delve deeper into the very core of medieval daily life to truly understand the relentless pressures that drove this seemingly contradictory search for altered states. It wasn't simply about escaping physical pain, though that was a constant motivator. It was about escaping the sheer unremitting monotony and often brutal reality of a life lived on the edge. Imagine, if you will, the constant dull roar of an empty stomach. Hunger was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a looming specter, a persistent ache, a stark reminder of your vulnerability. Harvests could fail due to fickle weather pests or raiding parties, meaning starvation was a very real, very personal threat. This wasn't a world of abundance. It was a world where every meal was a hard-won victory and every winter was a desperate battle for survival. Consider the pervasive discomfort. Your clothing, likely coarse wool or linen, would have been itchy, stiff, and rarely washed. The concept of personal hygiene as we know it simply did not exist for most. The air inside your home, a small, dark, often smoky dwelling, would be thick with the smells of cooking fires, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present livestock that often shared your living space. The notion of privacy, or even a quiet moment to oneself, was a luxury almost entirely unheard of. Life was communal, loud, and constantly impinged upon by the needs of survival and the close proximity of your neighbors who were likely experiencing the exact same array of discomforts. Beyond the physical, there was the profound psychological toll. The world was perceived as a terrifying, unpredictable place governed by the whims of God's saints and more often demons. Disease could strike without warning, sweeping through a village and decimating families. Child mortality rates were astronomically high, meaning grief was a frequent, agonizing companion. Every cough could be the precursor to a fatal illness, every fever a sign of impending doom. There was no scientific understanding of germs, no effective medicines, no hope of a swift recovery for many common ailments. The fear of the unknown, of the invisible forces that could bring plague or famine, was a constant low-level anxiety that permeated every aspect of existence. And then there was the feudal system, the unyielding social structure that dictated every aspect of your life. You were born into your station, whether peasant, artisan, or noble, and for the vast majority, there was little to no hope of upward mobility. Your labor was for your Lord. Your days were spent toiling in fields that were not your own, and your very existence was dependent on the whims of those above you. This was a life of profound powerlessness, where individual agency was severely limited. You could not simply decide to leave and seek a better life. You were tied to the land, beholden to your Lord, and subject to the dictates of a rigid hierarchy. This system, for all its perceived stability, created a deep, pervasive sense of oppression and resignation. Against this backdrop of physical discomfort, psychological dread, and social constraint, the appeal of anything that offered even a temporary reprieve became overwhelmingly powerful. A bit of poppy wine to dull the ache of a broken tooth, a mandrake draught to bring on a dreamless sleep after a day of back-breaking labor, or even the accidental hallucinogenic journey induced by ergot-laced bread. These weren't simply acts of indulgence. They were acts of desperation, attempts to find solace, to forget even for a fleeting moment the relentless pressure of simply existing in a world that offered so little comfort and so much hardship. The search for altered states was in many ways a testament to the enduring human spirit's refusal to simply surrender to the grim realities of medieval life. It was a search for release, a quiet rebellion against the overwhelming weight of their circumstances. To truly appreciate the medieval engagement with mind-altering substances, it's essential to understand the sheer volume and variety of flora that populated their landscape, and how much of this rich tapestry of plant life was imbued with both practical and mystical significance. For the medieval mind, nature was not just a collection of resources. It was a living, breathing entity filled with hidden powers and secret languages. Every tree, every flower, every weed could hold a key to healing, to poison, or to profound inner journeys. This was a world of intimate tactile connection with the botanical kingdom, a far cry from our modern plastic-wrapped, chemically synthesized pharmaceutical industry. Consider the common hedgerow a ubiquitous feature of the medieval landscape, dividing fields and marking boundaries. To the casual eye, it might just be a tangle of thorns and branches. But to the discerning eye of a medieval herbalist, it was a veritable pharmacy. Blackthorn berries, hawthorn leaves, elderflower, each held specific medicinal properties. And nestled amongst them, perhaps, would be a patch of henbane, its sticky leaves and peculiar flowers, a quiet harbinger of delirium, or a cluster of belladonna, its tempting dark berries, a stark warning of swift death. These plants weren't contained in neat, controlled environments. They grew wild, often literally on your doorstep, presenting both opportunity and peril. The knowledge of these plants was typically localized and highly specialized. There wasn't a universal pharmacopoeia. Instead, knowledge would be passed down through families from village to village or from master to apprentice within a monastic order. A certain family in one valley might know the precise method for extracting a potent painkiller from willow bark containing salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, while a wise woman in another region might specialize in concoctions that induced vivid dreams for divination. This meant that the availability and understanding of psychoactive substances could vary significantly, even over relatively short distances. A journey of a few days could take you from a region where henbane was a common medicinal herb to one where it was viewed with deep suspicion and fear. Furthermore, the act of preparing these substances was often as important as the substance itself. It was a ritualistic process steeped in superstition and prayer. The moon cycle might dictate the best time to harvest a particular root. A specific incantation might be whispered over a brewing potion to enhance its efficacy or ward off evil influences. The grinding of herbs with a mortar and pestle was not just a mechanical action, it was an act of alchemy transforming raw nature into something potent and purposeful. The mixing of an ointment was a careful dance between raw ingredient and base, ensuring the desired texture and absorption. These practices lent a sense of sacredness and intentionality to the process, blurring the lines between medicine magic and spiritual devotion. Think for a moment about the sounds and smells associated with these preparations. The dry rustle of dried leaves, the pungent aroma of crushed roots, the faint earthy scent of mushroom spores. The rhythmic thump of the pestle, the soft sizzle of an herb dropped into simmering water, the quiet hum of a prayer being murmured. This was a slow, deliberate process, often taking hours, sometimes days to complete. It required patience, knowledge, and a deep respect for the power contained within these humble plants. It also meant that dosage was often determined by observation and experience rather than precise measurement. A handful, or a thumb's length, were common instructions leading to the kind of unpredictable outcomes we've already discussed. The very concept of dosage, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There was no understanding of active chemical compounds or milligrams. A physician or herbalist might gauge the potency of a brew by its color, its smell, or simply by the reaction of previous patients, or rather, by whether they survived and seemed better, or just started talking to the chickens. This trial and error approach, while leading to moments of profound discovery, also meant that every ingestion of a potent substance was a gamble. You might find relief, or you might find yourself in a terrifying delirium. This inherent uncertainty, coupled with the profound need for relief, created a unique relationship between medieval people and the powerful, unpredictable botanical world around them, a relationship that was both pragmatic and deeply mystical. Let's now consider the subtle ways in which medieval people perhaps unknowingly stumbled into altered states, not just through direct consumption, but through environmental factors, and even the very fabric of their architectural spaces. Imagine for a moment the sensory world of a medieval commoner. It was a world of profound contrasts, bright sunlight outdoors, but dim flickering light indoors, the pervasive cold in winter, the suffocating heat in summer, and crucially, a world where the air itself was often a cocktail of unexpected influences. Take, for instance, the common medieval home. Typically, these were small, single-room dwellings, often shared not just by multiple generations of a family, but also by their livestock during colder months. Heating came from an open hearth, a simple fire pit in the center of the room with a hole in the roof, or perhaps a rudimentary chimney to allow smoke to escape. The reality, however, was that ventilation was often poor, and the air inside these homes would have been perpetually thick with wood smoke. This wasn't just an irritating haze. Chronic exposure to smoke, especially in poorly ventilated spaces, can lead to a host of respiratory issues, but also a constant mild state of oxygen deprivation. Prolonged low-level hypoxia can induce feelings of lethargy, lightheadedness, and a general dulling of the senses, a kind of constant low-grade wooziness that would have been simply accepted as part of being alive. Your daily life essentially was lived in a subtle, self-created fog. Beyond the home, consider the prevalence of certain natural phenomena. While we've discussed specific plants and fungi, the medieval landscape also presented other less obvious sources of altered perception. For instance, the presence of various molds and mildews, often growing unchecked in damp enclosed spaces like cellars or poorly maintained granaries. While many are harmless, some types of mold can produce mycotoxins that, when inhaled or ingested, can cause neurological symptoms, including disorientation, fatigue, and even hallucinations. Imagine spending hours working in a musty cellar, perhaps sorting grain and experiencing a subtle shift in perception, a feeling of being slightly off. To the medieval mind, this might be attributed to the damp or a passing evil spirit, rather than the microscopic fungi invisibly affecting their brains. The diet itself could play a role. Beyond the accidental ergot, medieval diets were often monotonous, lacking in essential nutrients, and prone to spoilage. Chronic malnutrition could lead to a variety of physiological and psychological symptoms, including fatigue, irritability, and cognitive impairment. A mind deprived of proper sustenance might be more susceptible to the influence of even mild psychoactive compounds, or simply more prone to the kind of hazy, unfocused thinking that could be misinterpreted as a visionary state. The low-level energy and dulled senses associated with a meager diet could create a baseline state of being that was already a few degrees removed from crisp, clear-headed awareness. Even the simple act of sleep, or rather the lack thereof, would have contributed to altered states. In a world without artificial light, work often ceased with the setting sun, but comfortable, uninterrupted sleep was a luxury. Drafty homes, uncomfortable beds, the constant presence of vermin, and the need to wake multiple times throughout the night for fear of fire, for prayer, or simply due to discomfort meant that many medieval people experienced chronic sleep deprivation. A perpetually sleep-deprived mind is prone to micro-sleeps, moments of waking dreams, heightened suggestibility, and an inability to distinguish clearly between reality and fantasy. The medieval practice of biphasic sleep, where people would sleep for a few hours, wake for an hour or two, often to pray, socialize, or engage in quiet tasks, and then return to sleep, might have been a coping mechanism for harsh conditions, but it also lent itself to a dreamlike, often hazy state of consciousness for much of the night. So while we've focused on the deliberate ingestion of substances, it's crucial to understand that the very environment and lifestyle of medieval people created a constant low-level susceptibility to altered perceptions. From the smoky air they breathed to the mold in their granaries, from their sparse diets to their fragmented sleep patterns, medieval life itself was a subtle, often involuntary journey through various states of consciousness. It was a world where reality itself could feel a little blurry around the edges, making the more potent, deliberate forms of mind alteration simply another step on a familiar path. To truly appreciate the medieval world's relationship with mind-altering substances, it's insightful to consider the contrasting perspectives across different social strata. While the common peasant's engagement was often rooted in desperation for pain relief or a momentary escape from hardship, the nobility and the burgeoning merchant class had access to different substances, different contexts, and arguably different motivations for seeking altered states. This wasn't just about survival. It was also about status, spiritual exploration, and sometimes simply an elaborate form of entertainment. For the nobility, leisure was a far more attainable commodity, and with leisure came the opportunity for more refined, or at least more deliberate experimentation. While a peasant might use henbane for a toothache, a lord might employ a carefully prepared draught for a prophetic dream, or to enhance a spiritual ritual performed in his private chapel. Imported spices and exotic herbs, unavailable to the common folk, might find their way into the noble household, allowing for a wider array of infusions and concoctions. Opium derived from the poppy, though known in various forms for millennia, was more readily accessible to the wealthy due to its cost and the trade routes required for its acquisition. While perhaps not getting high, in the modern sense, its use as a powerful sedative painkiller and sleep aid would have been a prized commodity for those who could afford it, offering a level of comfort utterly unimaginable to the vast majority of the population. Consider the role of monastic orders, which often bridged the gap between commoner and noble, while monks and nuns lived lives of austerity. They were also often the intellectual powerhouses of the age, meticulously cultivating herb gardens, translating ancient texts, and preserving knowledge. Their use of psychoactive plants was often, as we discussed, for spiritual purposes, to aid contemplation, to induce visions interpreted as divine, or to prepare the mind for profound prayer. But these were not haphazard experiments. They were often systematic, guided by centuries of accumulated wisdom, even if that wisdom lacked modern scientific understanding. The quiet cloisters of a monastery might have been home to some of the most controlled intentional explorations of altered consciousness in the medieval world, albeit for strictly defined spiritual ends. The meticulous record-keeping in their herbals describing the plants, their preparation, and their effects provides invaluable insights into this often hidden aspect of monastic life. The emerging merchant class, with their growing wealth and access to wider trade networks, also introduced new substances and new attitudes. These individuals, often more pragmatic and less tied to traditional feudal structures, might have encountered goods and practices from distant lands. While the hashish of the Islamic world was not widely available in Europe, other exotic spices and compounds would have circulated, potentially leading to new forms of experimentation. Their motivations might be less about spiritual purity and more about social connection, about offering novel experiences at gatherings, or simply about having access to whatever might be new and interesting from abroad. The expansion of trade brought with it not just goods, but ideas, and with them the potential for new ways to alter perception. Beyond class, gender played a significant role. As noted earlier, women, particularly midwives and wise women, were often the primary custodians of herbal knowledge, including that of psychoactive plants. Their intimate connection to health, birth, and death meant they were often the first recourse for ailments that formal medicine ignored. This gave them immense, albeit precarious, power. While noble women might have their own private apothecaries, and monastic women their carefully cultivated gardens, village women relied on inherited knowledge and practical experience, often operating outside the formal patriarchal structures.
Một môn 16 vượt quá 1.000 ký tự.
Let's expand our gaze to the broader cultural impact and symbolic significance of these mind-altering plants within medieval society beyond their immediate effects. These were not just inert chemicals. They were entities imbued with powerful folklore, deeply entwined with superstitions, and often appearing in art literature and even religious iconography. The plants themselves became characters in the medieval drama of life, whispering tales of warning promise and the thin veil between reality and the spirit world. Take, for instance, the pervasive imagery of the mandrake. Its human-like shape wasn't just a biological curiosity. It was a potent symbol. It was believed to embody the very essence of human life, or perhaps a miniature earthly spirit. This anthropomorphic quality fueled countless legends, from its supposed death shriek upon uprooting to its ability to bring wealth or fertility to its owner. Tiny mandrake figures carved from the root itself or from other materials in its likeness were worn as amulets carried in pouches or placed under beds. These weren't just decorative items. They were active participants in a belief system that saw the natural world as profoundly alive and interactive. The mandrake, therefore, was not merely a plant that could cause hallucinations. It was a living charm, a piece of magic that transcended its chemical properties, embodying the hopes and fears of its possessors. Belladonna, with its striking beauty and deadly nature, also held a powerful symbolic resonance. Its dark berries and delicate flowers stood as a constant reminder of life's precariousness, of the hidden dangers lurking beneath attractive surfaces. It became a metaphor for temptation, for the alluring yet ultimately destructive path. In a world where unseen forces were believed to constantly tempt humanity towards sin, a plant that could make one beautiful but also lead to madness or death was a perfect symbol of moral peril. Its very name, Beautiful Lady, speaks to this seductive danger, a warning whispered through the hedgerows. Beauty can betray, and what seems enchanting can swiftly bring ruin. The deliberate use of psychoactive plants in rituals, especially by cunning folk and those accused of witchcraft, elevated them to a deeply symbolic status. The flying ointments, for instance, weren't just a chemical cocktail. They were the supposed vehicle for supernatural travel, for journeys to sabbats, and encounters with demonic entities. The ingredients themselves, often from plants associated with liminal spaces like graveyards or shadowy woodlands, imbued the ointments with a sense of the uncanny and the forbidden. The act of applying these salves, particularly to sensitive areas of the body, was not just about absorption. It was a ritualistic transformation, a shedding of the mundane, and an embrace of the extraordinary, even if that extraordinary was a terrifying chemically induced nightmare. The broomstick as an applicator became more than a household tool. It became a charged symbol of forbidden power, a testament to the strange and scandalous means through which these visions were accessed. Even less overtly psychoactive elements like incense held profound symbolic weight. Frankincense and myrrh, with their biblical associations, weren't just fragrant. They were conduits to the divine symbols of purification and spiritual ascent. Their smoke rising towards the heavens was seen as carrying prayers and intentions directly to God. The very act of breathing in the scented air of a church became a spiritual practice, a way to absorb holiness into one's very being. The subtle tranquilizing effect was likely an accidental benefit, but the primary perception was one of sacred transformation of the earthly self being elevated towards the divine, enveloped in a cloud of spiritual efficacy. These plants and their effects didn't just exist in isolation. They shaped the very narratives people told about their world. They provided explanations for otherwise inexplicable phenomena. Strange illnesses, sudden fits, vivid dreams, or moments of apparent divine inspiration. They blurred the lines between natural and supernatural, between healing and magic, between piety and heresy. For the medieval mind, where the natural and spiritual worlds were intimately intertwined, a plant that could cause visions or alter perception was not just a plant. It was a key to other realms, a testament to the unseen forces that shaped their lives. This deep symbolic embedding meant that the medieval experience with altered states was far more than a simple chemical reaction. It was a profound cultural phenomenon, shaping beliefs, rituals, and the very stories they told about themselves and their place in a mysterious, often terrifying universe. Let's delve deeper into the often overlooked practical applications and unintended consequences of these substances within the broader medieval economy and daily grind. Beyond their direct impact on individual consciousness, these plants and the knowledge surrounding them subtly influenced commerce, social dynamics, and even rudimentary public health. Consider the role of specific plants in trade. While Europe might have been relatively isolated from the broader global economy compared to the Islamic world, regional trade networks were vibrant. Henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, along with other medicinal herbs, were valuable commodities. Herbalists and apothecaries would acquire them through local foraging, but also through specialized markets and traveling merchants. The rarity of mandrake, for instance, due to its difficult harvesting and unique properties, would have made it a prized and expensive item accessible primarily to wealthier individuals or professional healers. This created a small but significant economy around these botanical drugs, supporting a chain of gatherers, preparers, and vendors. Imagine a market day in a medieval town. Alongside the grain livestock and woven cloth, you might find a stall, perhaps a little more discreet, offering dried bundles of strange herbs and murky tinctures, each promising relief or revelation. The knowledge of these plants and their effects also created a subtle power dynamic. Those who possessed this knowledge, the cunning folk, the wise women, the skilled monks, held a unique form of social currency. They were sought out not just for physical ailments, but for psychological distress, for guidance, or for a touch of the extraordinary. This unofficial network of healers often filled the void left by formal medical institutions, which were scarce, expensive, and often ineffective. While sometimes feared, their skills were often indispensable, cementing their place as vital if precarious members of their communities. The fees for their services, whether in kind or in coin, contributed to their livelihood, allowing them to subsist often just above the poverty line by providing a service desperately needed by their neighbors. Then there are the economic consequences of mass accidental ingestion, particularly with ergot. When a dancing plague or an outbreak of gangrenous ergotism swept through a region, the economic impact would have been devastating. Farmers incapacitated by convulsions couldn't work their fields. Entire families might be wiped out or left permanently disabled by the loss of limbs. The fear and panic associated with these outbreaks could lead to social disruption, abandoned lands, and a significant drop in agricultural output, exacerbating already precarious food supplies. This was not just a health crisis. It was an economic catastrophe directly linked to a parasitic fungus hidden within the very staple of their diet. The solutions, like the Order of St. Anthony's hospitals, while benevolent, were also a response to a profound economic and social disruption caused by the widespread unintentional high. Furthermore, the practices surrounding alcohol brewing had significant economic implications. The widespread consumption of small beer meant a constant demand for grain, particularly barley and rye, supporting the agricultural sector. Brewing was a domestic industry for many, especially women, who often brewed for their households and sometimes for sale. This contributed to household incomes and local economies. Larger-scale brewing, often by monasteries or wealthy estates, employed laborers and contributed to regional trade. Alcohol wasn't just a beverage. It was a cornerstone of the medieval economy, driving agricultural production, supporting numerous trades, and providing a significant source of calories and often accidental comfort to the population. The daily rhythm of brewing, from malting the grain to fermenting the wort, was an integral part of countless households and communities. Even the trade in more exotic substances like mad honey contributed to a specialized, albeit risky, form of commerce. Merchants brave enough to navigate the dangerous mountain passes and deal with its volatile effects could command high prices, providing unique luxury items or potent medical remedies to those with the means. This demonstrated a nascent form of consumer demand for specialty goods, even if those goods carried inherent dangers. These economic threads, often hidden beneath the grand narratives of kings and battles, reveal a vibrant, complex reality, where the desire for altered states, whether for relief or recreation, played a tangible role in shaping the daily lives and broader structures of medieval society. As we continue to peel back the layers of medieval consciousness, let's consider the intricate relationship between these mind-altering substances and the deeply ingrained religious and superstitious beliefs of the era. For the medieval mind, the world was alive with unseen forces, angels, demons, saints, and a host of lesser spirits, all constantly interacting with human affairs. In this highly charged spiritual landscape, any alteration of perception, any vision or strange sensation was rarely attributed to mere chemistry. Instead, it was almost universally interpreted through a divine or demonic lens. Imagine a peasant, perhaps suffering from a chronic illness, who partakes of a potent herbal brew from the local cunning woman. During the ensuing delirium, they might experience vivid hallucinations, perhaps a terrifying encounter with a horned demon, or a blissful vision of the Virgin Mary surrounded by a choir of angels. To this individual and to their community, these experiences would not be seen as a side effect of the herbs, but as direct, tangible proof of the supernatural world's intrusion into their reality. The vision of the demon would confirm their deepest fears of evil's omnipresence, perhaps even suggesting a personal struggle with temptation or sin. The vision of the Virgin Mary, on the other hand, would be a sign of divine favor, a testament to their piety, or a promise of salvation. The substance was merely the catalyst, the unlocking key for a spiritual truth already believed to exist. This fundamental belief shaped how authorities reacted to such phenomena. The Church, as the arbiter of spiritual truth, was constantly vigilant against anything that challenged its monopoly on divine communication. Visions that occurred within the strictures of approved rituals, like those induced by incense during Mass or experienced by canonized saints, were considered legitimate and miraculous. These were proofs of God's grace, evidence that the faithful were indeed on the right path. However, visions or altered states that arose from unsanctioned sources particularly from pagan herbs or witchcraft, were immediately suspect. They were deemed the work of the devil, insidious temptations designed to lead souls astray. The individual experiencing such a vision was not just chemically impaired. They were either possessed by a demon or actively colluding with evil forces. The consequences for such a misstep could be severe, ranging from exorcism to excommunication, or even accusations of heresy and witchcraft with potentially fatal outcomes. This created a precarious tightrope for anyone dealing with psychoactive plants. A local herbalist might genuinely believe she was helping her community by using henbane to ease a difficult birth, and the resulting delirium might be accepted as a difficult but necessary side effect. But if the patient in their altered state began to babble blasphemies or speak of pacts with demons, the herbalist herself could suddenly find her good intentions twisted into evidence of malevolent magic. The fluid boundary between healer and witch was often determined not by intent, but by outcome and interpretation by the vagaries of a chemically induced experience. Even the deliberate act of seeking visions through substances, particularly for divinatory purposes, was deeply rooted in this superstitious framework. If a person consumed mandrake to gain foresight into a future event, the prophecy that emerged, however distorted, would be taken seriously. It would be analyzed, debated, and acted upon often with significant consequences. The source of the altered state was less important than the perceived truth revealed during it, a truth that was always understood to be rooted in supernatural influence rather than chemical reaction. In essence, medieval people lived in a universe where the physical and spiritual realms were constantly bleeding into one another. There was no scientific framework to separate the subjective experience of a drug from the objective reality of the world. Therefore, any potent experience that transcended normal perception was by definition spiritual. It was a message from beyond, whether from the heavens or the underworld. This pervasive belief system meant that getting high was never just about a temporary escape. It was often a profound, terrifying, or ecstatic encounter with the very forces that they believed governed their souls and their destiny. It was a constant reminder that the veil between worlds was thin, and sometimes a simple root or a fungus could part it just enough to reveal glimpses of the miraculous or the monstrous. Let's further explore the intersection of these substances with the medieval understanding of the human body and mind, a concept vastly different from our modern physiological and psychological models. For medieval thinkers, the body was a complex system governed by the four humors: blood yellow, bile, black bile, and phlegm, whose balance dictated health and temperament. Illness, both physical and mental, was seen as an imbalance of these humors, or as the result of external spiritual forces. Into this framework, the effects of psychoactive plants were interpreted through a lens that combined rudimentary observation with deeply entrenched theological and philosophical beliefs. Consider, for instance, a person experiencing the wild agitation and hallucinations of henbane poisoning. To a medieval physician or healer, this might be seen as an excess of hot and dry humors, perhaps yellow bile causing an internal fever that manifested as madness. The solution would not be to counteract a chemical, but to restore humoral balance, perhaps through bloodletting, purging, or the application of cooling herbs. The delirium was not a neurological event. It was a physical manifestation of an internal imbalance, or if the symptoms were particularly bizarre, external demonic influence affecting the humors. This fundamental misunderstanding of brain chemistry meant that the very nature of the altered state was profoundly misinterpreted. Similarly, The sedative effects of poppy or mandrake might be explained as restoring a balance of cold and moist humors, settling an agitated spirit, or promoting sleep by cooling an overheated brain. The direct chemical action was secondary, if considered at all, to the overarching theory of humoral balance. This perspective also meant that addiction as a concept was largely absent. A person who habitually consumed alcohol or opium might be seen as having a moral failing, a weakness of character, or perhaps an excess of a certain humor that predisposed them to such behavior. The idea of a physical dependence or a chemical alteration of the brain that demanded more of the substance was beyond their grasp. The individual was seen as morally culpable for their overindulgence rather than a victim of a powerful chemical effect. The medieval understanding of mental illness was also profoundly shaped by these views. A person suffering from profound depression, melancholy, an excess of black bile might be treated with alcohol or other mood-altering herbs, not as antidepressants, but as a means to warm or dry the system to rebalance the humors. The temporary uplift or detachment provided by these substances might be seen as a successful, if superficial, treatment for a spiritual or humoral ailment. Conversely, someone experiencing paranoid delusions or violent fits, perhaps from ergot poisoning, might be seen as possessed by a demon requiring exorcism and spiritual intervention rather than medical treatment. The distinction between a chemical psychosis and demonic possession was to the medieval mind often non-existent, and the interpretation depended heavily on the specific symptoms and the prevailing cultural beliefs of the region. Furthermore, the very act of seeing things under the influence of these substances was interpreted through a lens of strict dualism, good or evil. There was no middle ground of just a hallucination. If you saw angels, it was God's grace. If you saw demons, it was the devil's work. The lack of a scientific framework for understanding the brain meant that every subjective experience had to be assigned an objective external cause, usually of a supernatural nature. This forced interpretation added another layer of fear and anxiety to the ingestion of powerful plants. You weren't just taking a risk with your body. You were taking a risk with your immortal soul, opening yourself up to potential divine favor or demonic manipulation. This limited yet deeply held understanding of the human body and mind profoundly shaped the medieval experience with altered states. It meant that experimentation was often blind, consequences were misinterpreted, and the line between healing and heresy was dangerously thin. The individual caught between the relentless pain of daily life and a belief system that saw spiritual forces in every shadow navigated a perilous path, seeking solace and meaning in substances whose true nature remained shrouded in mystery and profound misunderstanding. Let's delve deeper into the often unseen social rituals and informal networks that underpinned the distribution and consumption of these psychoactive substances in medieval society. Beyond the formal settings of the monastery or the occasional barber surgeon, there was a vibrant, often clandestine exchange of knowledge and remedies, particularly among women and within tight-knit village communities. These were the true underground markets of medieval mind alteration. Imagine the casual exchange of information at the village well or during a communal spinning bee. Old Agnes's cough is dreadful, but the elderflower brew that Alara makes for her seems to put her right to sleep, even if she does babble about talking squirrels for a bit. Or, my cousin tried that mandrake root for his gout, and while the pain lessened, he swore he saw his dead grandmother asking for her knitting needles. These were not hushed, illicit transactions. They were often open, if cautious, discussions about what worked, what didn't, and what particularly strange side effects one might expect. Knowledge was communal, practical, and exchanged person to person, creating a robust, if unsystematic, oral tradition of herbal pharmacology. Women in particular formed crucial networks for the sharing of this knowledge. As primary caregivers, they were intimately acquainted with illness, childbirth, and death, and therefore with the need for effective remedies. Midwives, in addition to assisting with birth, often possessed a deep understanding of herbs that could ease labor pains, induce sleep, or even, in desperate cases, terminate a pregnancy. This knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, or from elder to younger woman, created a powerful, often unspoken bond. It was a form of mutual aid, a collective effort to cope with the relentless physical realities of medieval life. The witchcraft accusations that often targeted these women were in part a patriarchal attempt to dismantle these powerful female-led networks of knowledge and support to control access to remedies that bypassed male authority. These informal networks also extended to the cunning folk themselves. They weren't isolated figures. They often had apprentices, informants, and a loyal clientele. A village cunning woman might send her young assistant to gather specific herbs from a distant patch of woodland, or barter her remedies for goods and services. This created a local economy of healing, often operating on the margins of official commerce, but nonetheless vital to the community. Payment might be in chicken's eggs or a promise of future labor, rather than coin, further embedding these exchanges into the fabric of daily life. The social acceptance or rejection of certain substances also varied dramatically by community. In some isolated hamlets, a low-alcohol honey mead that produced a gentle buzz might be seen as perfectly normal for daily consumption. In others, a similar brew might be viewed with suspicion, perhaps seen as leading to idleness or sin. The very local nature of medieval life meant that social norms around mind-altering substances were highly decentralized, adapting to local customs, available plants, and the temperament of the local lord or priest. This meant that what was tolerated or even embraced in one village could be condemned as heresy just a few miles down the road. Even the rituals around consumption could be highly social. Think of the communal feasting often fueled by generous amounts of ale where social bonds were reinforced, stories were told, and inhibitions loosened. While not explicitly about getting high, the collective consumption of alcohol created a shared altered state, fostering camaraderie, easing tensions, and allowing for expressions of joy or sorrow that might otherwise be suppressed. The medieval tavern, far from being just a place to drink, was a hub of social interaction, a stage for shared experience, where alcohol acted as the great equalizer, softening the edges of social hierarchies, if only for a few hours. These informal social networks and communal rituals were vital to the medieval experience of altered states. They represented a grassroots approach to coping with hardship, sharing knowledge, and fostering community in a challenging world. They highlight how deeply ingrained these substances were in the daily lives of ordinary people, not as exotic, illicit drugs, but as practical tools, communal catalysts, and a testament to humanity's enduring quest for solace, connection, and a momentary escape from the relentless realities of their world. Let's further explore the long-term societal impacts and historical echoes of medieval attitudes toward mind-altering substances, tracing how these early interactions laid the groundwork for later developments and often misguided prohibitions. The medieval period, in its strange blend of practical need and fearful superstition, left a complex legacy that reverberates even into our modern understanding of drugs and consciousness. One of the most significant long-term impacts was the ingrained suspicion of plant-based remedies that induced visionary states, particularly those associated with women and folk medicine. The Church's aggressive campaign against witchcraft, which often targeted herbalists and wise women, effectively drove much of this traditional knowledge underground or destroyed it entirely. The flying ointments, once perhaps a source of peculiar chemically induced visions, became definitive proof of demonic pacts leading to torture and execution. This deeply ingrained fear of non-sanctioned, naturally derived altered states contributed to a long-standing Western bias against psychedelics and visionary plants, viewing them as inherently dangerous or morally corrupt rather than as potential tools for healing or spiritual exploration. This fear persisted for centuries, influencing colonial attitudes towards indigenous plant medicine and forming the very basis of many modern drug prohibitions. Conversely, the widespread acceptance of alcohol as a daily beverage, even for children, laid the foundation for its enduring social and cultural dominance in many Western societies. Its role as a safe hydrator in an era of contaminated water transformed it from a mere intoxicant into a cultural staple. This historical necessity cemented alcohol's position as a socially acceptable, even encouraged form of mind alteration, fundamentally different from the fear and suspicion that surrounded other substances. This dichotomy, alcohol as benign, other powerful plants as inherently dangerous or demonic, is a direct legacy of the medieval period, shaping laws, social norms, and public health attitudes for centuries to come. The tavern culture of medieval Europe evolved into the pubs and bars of later centuries, becoming central to social life, while the quiet knowledge of the herbalist faded into the shadows deemed dangerous and superstitious. The medieval experience with ergot, though accidental, also left a chilling historical echo. The dancing plagues and the mysterious outbreaks of gangrenous disease served as stark reminders of nature's unpredictable power and the vulnerability of human health to unseen forces. While the true cause remained unknown for centuries, the memory of these terrifying epidemics contributed to a general societal anxiety about unknown illnesses and the potential for collective madness. This historical trauma, though not fully understood, might have subtly influenced later anxieties about mass hysteria and the susceptibility of populations to external influences. Even the modern scientific debate about ergot's role in events like the Salem witch trials highlights this lingering historical curiosity and the desire to find rational explanations for past madness. Furthermore, the medieval period's lack of scientific understanding regarding brain chemistry and toxicology meant that accidental poisonings and misinterpretations of drug effects were common. This trial and error approach, while leading to some effective remedies, also resulted in countless tragedies and persistent superstitions. The enduring legacy of this ignorance is a reminder of the vital importance of scientific inquiry in distinguishing between genuine therapeutic effects, dangerous side effects, and purely superstitious interpretations. The transition from humoral theory to modern medicine was a slow, arduous process, with the medieval period standing as a stark example of what happens when powerful substances are used without a fundamental understanding of their biological mechanisms. In essence, the medieval relationship with mind-altering substances was a foundational chapter in humanity's long and complicated history with altered consciousness. It was a period defined by profound need, limited knowledge, and a deeply spiritual worldview that saw every physiological and psychological change as a sign from above or below. The legacy of this era is a complex tapestry of deeply ingrained cultural biases towards certain substances, a persistent fear of others, and a historical record filled with bizarre, sometimes tragic attempts to find solace, meaning, or simply escape in the powerful, mysterious compounds that grew from the very earth beneath their feet. Let us now shift our focus to the medieval concept of entertainment, and how, in the absence of modern distractions, altered states often served as a profound, if sometimes terrifying, form of diversion. In a world without flickering screens, without curated playlists, and without the endless novelty of the internet, the human mind sought stimulation and escape in far more visceral ways. This meant that the line between deliberate fun and accidental hallucinogenic experience often blurred, especially after a particularly long and arduous day. Imagine the medieval evening. After the sun dips below the horizon, plunging the world into a darkness broken only by firelight or a few precious candles, options for amusement were severely limited. Storytelling was paramount tales of saints and sinners. Heroic knights and mischievous sprites often passed down orally, their narratives swelling and contracting with each telling. Music, typically simple and instrumental, offered a comforting rhythm. But these were passive entertainments. For something more active, more profound, medieval people sometimes turned to what was readily available. Consider the role of communal drinking in taverns or at village gatherings already discussed in the context of alcohol. These weren't just places for hydration. They were social hubs, spaces where the shared experience of altered consciousness, however mild, became a form of collective entertainment. The inhibitions loosened, the laughter came easier, and the stories grew taller. Perhaps a particularly wild dance broke out, fueled by copious amounts of ale. In a world of rigid social structures and constant struggle, these moments of collective release, enhanced by alcohol, served as vital forms of psychological decompression, a way to forget one's troubles and simply exist in a state of convivial, slightly hazy camaraderie. It was the medieval equivalent of a night out, a chance to unwind, even if the unwinding often involved a bit of stumbling and slurred speech. Beyond alcohol, the deliberate, if dangerous, consumption of stronger psychoactive plants could also be seen as a form of extreme entertainment, particularly for those with a more adventurous spirit or a profound desire for novelty. For a peasant living a life of predictable toil, the prospect of experiencing vivid hallucinations of seeing things that defied normal reality might be a compelling, albeit risky, adventure. The potential for encountering spirits, for conversing with the unseen, for transcending the mundane, would have been a profoundly captivating prospect. It was an internal spectacle, a personal cinema of the mind, however terrifying or bewildering it might become. The very uncertainty, the sheer gamble of what the substance might reveal, would have been part of its macabre allure. Moreover, the stories and folklore surrounding these plants often served as a form of entertainment in themselves. The terrifying legend of the mandrake's scream, the bizarre visions induced by henbane, the madness of the dancing plagues, these were not just cautionary tales. They were captivating narratives that titillated and fascinated. People loved to share accounts of those who had seen things or done strange deeds under the influence. These stories reinforced the power of the plants and the thin veil between the mundane and the magical, offering a form of thrilling supernatural gossip that punctuated the otherwise monotonous rhythm of daily life. Even within religious contexts, the pursuit of visions, often aided by substances like incense or prolonged fasting, could be seen as a form of spiritual entertainment, a profound internal drama. The ecstatic visions of saints, often described in vivid detail, provided a template for what one might aspire to experience. For a medieval devotee, the possibility of a direct personal encounter with the divine, however induced, was the ultimate form of spiritual theater, a deeply moving and intensely personal experience that transcended all earthly forms of amusement. It was the ultimate spectacle played out within the theater of one's own mind. Ultimately, in a world where overt entertainment was scarce and life was often brutally hard, the human desire for novelty, for stimulation, and for escape found expression in surprising forms. Whether through the communal haze of ale, the personal journey into delirium via a potent herb, or the shared fascination with the bizarre tales of those who had ventured into altered states, the medieval period found its own unique, often dangerous forms of amusement. These were entertainments that played not on stages, but within the very landscapes of their minds and the shared narratives of their unpredictable world. Finally, let us reflect on the enduring human motivations that drove medieval people to seek altered states. Motivations that echo across centuries and connect their often grim realities to our own complex lives. Beyond the specific substances and cultural interpretations, the fundamental desires for relief, escape, insight, and connection remain timeless, albeit expressed in vastly different ways. One primary immutable motivation was the pervasive presence of pain. As we've explored, medieval life was simply painful. Chronic aches, untreated injuries, agonizing illnesses, and the sheer physical toll of manual labor were constants. In the absence of modern analgesics, any substance that could dull this relentless suffering even temporarily was a godsend. Whether it was a poppy infusion for a broken bone or henbane for a toothache, the drive to alleviate physical agony remains a universal human impulse. Their getting high was very often simply an attempt to get less hurt, a desperate search for comfort in a world that offered very little. This pragmatic use of psychoactive plants for pain management stands as a testament to human resilience and ingenuity in the face of suffering. Beyond physical discomfort, there was the profound need for escape from a life that was often monotonous, oppressive, and filled with existential dread. The feudal system offered little agency. Constant hunger was a looming threat, and the fear of plague or famine was ever present. To briefly transcend these realities, to forget the weight of a grinding existence, was a powerful lure. Alcohol offered a communal escape, a chance to shed the day's burdens in shared camaraderie. More potent herbs offered a deeper, more profound oblivion, a temporary vacation from the self and the harsh world. This desire for mental respite, for a moment of forgetting, is a deeply relatable human experience, whether sought through medieval herbs or modern distractions. It speaks to our innate need to process or sometimes simply avoid overwhelming stress. Then there was the yearning for insight and connection to something greater than oneself. In a pre-scientific age, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were fluid, altered states were often seen as direct conduits to spiritual realms. Visions were not hallucinations. They were divine messages, encounters with angels, or terrifying confrontations with demons. Monks sought them for spiritual enlightenment, and common folk might turn to them for answers to desperate prayers. This quest for meaning, for a glimpse behind the veil of ordinary reality, is a powerful driver for humanity, irrespective of historical context. It highlights our innate curiosity about the cosmos, our desire to understand our place within it, and our search for transcendence. For them, a plant could be a literal key to understanding the will of God or the machinations of the devil. Finally, there was the human fascination with novelty and the extraordinary. In a world with limited entertainment and few opportunities for grand adventure, the internal journey offered by psychoactive substances could be a powerful, albeit often terrifying, experience. The bizarre nature of the visions, the disorientation, the sheer unpredictability, These could be captivating in their own right. The stories of those who had seen things fueled folklore and gossip, providing a unique form of macabre entertainment. This desire for the novel, for an experience that shakes one out of the mundane, resonates even today in our pursuit of thrilling experiences and new forms of media. So when we look back at what getting high was like in medieval times, we're not just observing a historical curiosity. We're witnessing a raw, unvarnished expression of universal human desires. Desires for comfort in the face of pain, for peace in the midst of chaos, for meaning in a world that often seemed meaningless, and for a touch of the extraordinary in lives that were overwhelmingly ordinary. Their methods were primitive, their understanding flawed, and their risks profound. But their underlying motivations were in essence no different from our own. They were simply people trying to make sense of a difficult world and finding in the mysterious bounty of nature a sometimes terrifying, sometimes blissful path to a different reality. And so, as the faint echoes of medieval life begin to recede, as the last whispers of the cunning folk and the quiet chants of the monks fade into the past, you can begin to feel the gentle drift of stillness. The scents of wood smoke and damp earth give way to the comforting familiarity of your own space. The ancient fears of ergot-laced bread and screaming mandrakes melt into the soft contours of your modern world, a world where warmth is constant. Pain is often managed, and the vast, bewildering array of the unknown has thankfully been categorized and understood by science rather than superstition. Let your thoughts slowly detach from the harsh realities of their existence, from the constant hum of hunger and the pervasive chill of discomfort. Feel the weight of your blankets, the softness of your pillow, the quiet hum of your modern home. What a journey it was for them to find even a fleeting moment of peace or altered perspective. What a stark contrast to the quiet comfort you now inhabit. There is no need for magic roots or bitter potions to find your rest tonight. The ancient anxieties, the desperate searches, they belong to another time, another world. As your breath deepens and slows, allow the images of belladonna and henbane, of incense and small beer, to simply dissolve into the quiet dark. The veil between the medieval world and your present comfort is now thick and reassuring. There are no screaming roots here, no accidental dancing plagues, just the gentle rhythm of your own breath, the soft ebb and flow of peace. And as the last thoughts of history recede, know that you are safe, you are comfortable, and sleep, a truly peaceful, unburdened sleep, is waiting. Sweet dreams.